I thought long sleeves could hide everything. I was wrong. Most people see what they expect to see. A smile. A polite greeting. A waitress carrying a tray through a crowded dining room. They do not see the effort behind it. They do not see the exhaustion hiding behind carefully applied makeup or the way someone learns to move just enough to avoid attention. My name is Grace Miller, and for almost 6 months, I had become an expert at pretending everything was fine. The restaurant was already busy when I arrived for my evening shift. Golden light reflected from crystal glasses. Soft music drifted through the dining room. The scent of garlic, fresh bread, and expensive wine filled the air. Guests laughed at their tables while servers hurried between conversations and orders. It looked perfect. That was the point. People came here to forget their problems. I came here to forget mine. I adjusted the sleeves of my dark uniform and forced a smile before stepping onto the floor. Nobody seemed to notice anything unusual. My manager greeted me. A bartender waved from across the room. Another waitress asked if I could cover part of her section later that evening. Normal conversations. Normal people. Normal lives. Exactly what I wanted. I picked up my first tray and moved carefully through the restaurant. The shift started smoothly. Table 12 wanted another bottle of wine. Table 7 requested dessert menus. A family near the windows asked for recommendations. I smiled. I nodded. I worked. For a little while, I almost convinced myself that I was fine. Then the front doors opened. The atmosphere changed immediately. It was subtle at first. Conversations grew quieter. Several employees straightened their posture. The manager appeared from nowhere and moved toward the entrance. I did not need to look to know who had arrived. Everyone in the city knew the name Dominic Valenti. Some people admired him. Others feared him. Most did both. I kept my eyes on the tray in my hands and continued walking. That was easier than looking toward the entrance. Easier than acknowledging the sudden tension spreading through the room. I delivered 2 orders and collected empty plates before finally glancing toward the VIP section. Dominic sat at the largest table near the back of the restaurant. Several well-dressed men surrounded him. Expensive watches caught the light whenever they moved. Yet, despite the wealth in the room, it was Dominic who drew attention. He was not speaking. He was not smiling. He simply sat there observing everything. The strange thing about power is that it rarely announces itself. Real power does not need to. I looked away immediately and returned to work. The less attention I attracted, the better. That had become another survival skill. Stay quiet. Stay unnoticed. Keep moving. Unfortunately, life rarely cooperates with plans. About an hour later, I reached for a tray near the kitchen entrance. A sharp ache shot through my arm. My hand slipped. One glass tipped sideways. I caught it before it shattered, but not before several drops of water splashed across the floor. Embarrassment rushed through me. I bent down quickly to clean the mess. As I reached for a napkin, my sleeve slid back farther than I intended. Only for a second. Maybe less. I pulled it down immediately and stood. But when I looked across the restaurant, my stomach dropped. Dominic Valenti was no longer talking to the people at his table. He was looking directly at me. And somehow, from the opposite side of a crowded room, I knew he had seen exactly what I had spent months trying to hide. The moment our eyes met across the restaurant, I knew my evening was over. Not because Dominic Valenti stood up. Not because the room seemed to shift around him. Because for the first time in months, someone had noticed what I had worked so hard to hide. I turned away immediately and focused on my next table. A couple near the window wanted coffee. Another guest requested the check. Simple tasks. Familiar tasks. I clung to them like a lifeline. If I kept moving, maybe the feeling would disappear. Maybe I had imagined the entire thing. Maybe Dominic had simply been looking in my direction. Unfortunately, hope can be a very fragile thing. 20 minutes later, I carried a tray of desserts toward the dining room. The restaurant remained busy, but I could feel a strange awareness following me. Every time I glanced toward the VIP section, Dominic seemed to be watching. Not constantly. Not obviously. Yet, somehow he noticed details everyone else ignored. The way I favored one arm. The way I avoided crowded spaces. The way I stepped aside whenever someone moved too close. Most people saw a waitress doing her job. Dominic appeared to see everything else. By 9 o'clock, my nerves were exhausted. I escaped into the service hallway behind the kitchen under the excuse of organizing supplies. The noise of the dining room faded behind the swinging doors. For a few precious moments, I stood alone. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. Then another. Rough night. The voice startled me. I opened my eyes to find Olivia, another server, leaning against a storage shelf. I forced a smile. Just tired. She studied me for a second. Long enough to make me uncomfortable. Then she nodded and changed the subject. I appreciated that more than she realized. A few minutes later, I returned to the dining room. The moment I stepped back onto the floor, the manager approached. Grace. My stomach tightened. Yes, Mr. Valenti would like to speak with you. Every sound around me seemed to disappear. Me? The manager nodded. Private dining room. Whenever you are ready. Whenever you are ready. The words sounded polite, but everyone knew they were not really a suggestion. I glanced toward the VIP section. Dominic was no longer sitting there. His chair stood empty. My pulse accelerated. For several seconds, I considered refusing. I considered walking out the back door and never returning. But reality quickly caught up with imagination. This was my job. Running would only create more questions. So I straightened my uniform, adjusted my sleeves, and walked toward the private hallway. The corridor seemed longer than usual. Soft lights illuminated framed photographs along the walls. At the end stood a dark wooden door. My footsteps slowed. Every instinct told me to turn around. Instead, I raised my hand and knocked. Come in. His voice was calm, controlled. I opened the door. Dominic stood beside a large window overlooking the city. The lights below reflected against the glass behind him. He did not look intimidating. Somehow that made him more intimidating. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then his gaze dropped briefly to my sleeves before returning to my face. Miss Miller, he said quietly. You have spent all evening pretending everything is fine. The room became impossibly silent. And I think we both know it is not. There are questions that make people uncomfortable. Then there are questions that expose the parts of your life you have spent months trying to bury. Dominic's words settled heavily between us. You have spent all evening pretending everything is fine. And I think we both know it is not. I looked away immediately. The city lights beyond the window blurred together. I am fine. The lie sounded weak even to me. Dominic did not argue. He did not raise his voice. Somehow that made everything worse. Most people would have accepted the answer because accepting it would be easier. Dominic simply stood there, watching. Waiting. You do not have to explain anything to me, he said quietly. But you should stop pretending there is nothing to explain. My throat tightened. For a moment, I hated him for noticing. I hated the calm certainty in his voice. I hated the fact that part of me felt relieved. You do not know anything about my life, I said. The words came out sharper than I intended. Dominic nodded once. That is true. He walked toward a small table near the window and poured a glass of water. Which is why I am asking instead of assuming. The room fell silent again. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside, every second felt longer than the one before it. I accepted the water he offered and wrapped both hands around the glass. The warmth helped steady my nerves. Slightly. Why do you care? I finally asked. Dominic looked genuinely surprised by the question. Because someone should. I stared at him. No dramatic speech. No complicated explanation. Just 4 words. Because someone should. Something shifted inside me. Not enough to lower my guard. Enough to make it harder to maintain it. Before I could respond, a knock sounded at the door. One of Dominic's associates stepped into the room. The man approached quietly and handed him a folder. Dominic glanced at the contents for only a few seconds. His expression never changed. The associate left immediately afterward. I noticed something then. Dominic was not reading business reports. The file contained employee information, restaurant schedules, staff records. One page displayed my name. My pulse accelerated. You investigated me? Dominic closed the folder. Only after I became concerned. That does not make it better. To my surprise, a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. No, it probably does not. The honesty caught me off guard again. He placed the folder on the table without opening it further. Grace, I know where you work. I know where you live. I know you volunteer at a literacy program on weekends. I froze. How? Because I wanted facts instead of assumptions. He paused. And the facts do not match the person sitting in front of me. A chill moved through me. What does that mean? Dominic's gaze lowered briefly toward my sleeves before returning to my eyes. It means every person who knows you describes someone kind, dependable, and strong. His voice remained calm. Yet tonight you looked frightened every time someone moved too close. The room became impossibly quiet. I could not find an answer because there was no answer that would not reveal the truth. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then my hand shifted slightly as I set the glass down. The sleeve of my uniform slipped back farther than before. Not much. Just enough. Dominic saw it immediately. So did I. This time, neither of us looked away. And in the silence that followed, I realized there was no longer any point pretending he had not seen what I had spent months trying to hide. The strange thing about being seen is that it can feel more frightening than being ignored. I stared at the edge of my sleeve and then at Dominic. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us until it felt almost physical. Every instinct told me to leave, to walk out of the room, to return to the dining floor and pretend none of this had happened. Before I could act on that impulse, I stepped backward toward the door. I should get back to work, I said quickly. The excuse sounded weak. We both knew it. Dominic did not move immediately. He simply watched me reach for the handle. My hand was already touching the metal when I heard the quiet click behind me. I froze. Dominic had crossed the room and turned the lock. The sound was soft, barely noticeable. Yet it sent a wave of panic through my chest. Why did you do that? My voice came out sharper than intended. Dominic immediately stepped away from the door. Far enough to give me space. Far enough to make something clear. He was not blocking my path. He was protecting it. Because nobody else is coming into this room unless you want them to. I stared at him. Confusion replaced fear. What? Dominic glanced toward the hallway beyond the door. The manager has already asked twice whether everything is all right. 3 members of my security team are concerned. Half the restaurant is curious. His expression remained calm. You deserve one place tonight where nobody can interrupt you. The explanation caught me off guard. I had expected pressure, questions, demands. Instead, he was giving me control. For several moments, I could not think of a response. Dominic returned to the opposite side of the room and sat down near the window. The distance felt intentional, respectful. You can leave whenever you choose, he said. The lock is for them, not for you. Rain continued tapping softly against the glass outside. The city lights shimmered beyond the window like distant stars. Something inside me began to settle. Not completely, just enough. I slowly stepped away from the door. You really are not going to force me to explain anything? Dominic looked almost offended by the suggestion. No. The answer arrived instantly. Then why are we here? He folded his hands. Because someone taught you to hide pain instead of asking for help. The words struck harder than I expected. My eyes dropped toward the floor. Months of exhaustion suddenly felt heavier. You do not understand. Then help me understand. His voice never changed. No judgment. No anger. Just patience. Nobody had spoken to me like that. In a very long time. I walked toward one of the chairs and sat down slowly. My hands trembled slightly. I hated that he noticed. I hated even more that he pretended not to. The room remained quiet. Safe. For the first time all evening, I was not performing. Not smiling for customers. Not reassuring coworkers. Not pretending everything was normal. Dominic waited without speaking. Without rushing me. Without demanding answers. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I looked up. Do you know what happens when people find out something is wrong? I asked quietly. Dominic shook his head once. Tell me. I swallowed hard. The city lights blurred beyond the glass. Most of them look away. The sadness in my own voice surprised me. Dominic held my gaze for several seconds before responding. Grace, he said softly, I am not most people. People think the hardest part is telling the truth. They are wrong. The hardest part is deciding whether the person listening will stay after they hear it. I sat across from Dominic and stared at the rain sliding down the window. His words echoed quietly in my mind. I am not most people. For a moment, I wanted to believe him. Then years of disappointment reminded me how dangerous hope could be. You keep looking at me like I am supposed to say something, I said softly. Dominic remained calm. Only if you want to. I almost laughed. The answer was so different from what I expected that it caught me off guard. Most people filled silence because silence made them uncomfortable. Dominic seemed perfectly willing to sit there all night if necessary. The room felt strangely peaceful. Warm light reflected across the polished wood table. The sounds of the restaurant were distant now. Muted. Almost unreal. It felt like we existed in a different world from everyone else. I lowered my eyes toward my hands. Sometimes people get used to carrying things alone. Dominic nodded once. I know. The simple response made me look up. For the first time, I noticed something unusual. He was not trying to compare experiences. He was not trying to make the conversation about himself. He was simply acknowledging what I said. It felt unexpectedly comforting. And sometimes, I continued carefully, people stop talking because they think nobody can help anyway. Dominic studied me for several seconds. Did someone convince you of that? The question landed with uncomfortable accuracy. I looked away again. The answer was obvious. Silence became my response. Somehow, Dominic understood it. He leaned back slightly in his chair. Grace, I am only going to ask one question tonight. My pulse quickened. One. He nodded. One. The promise surprised me. I had expected dozens. What is the question? The room seemed to grow quieter. Even the rain outside appeared to soften. Dominic's expression never changed. Who taught you to be afraid of asking for help? I closed my eyes. Not because I wanted to avoid the question. Because it hurt. The sadness inside me felt older than the events that created it. It came from every ignored warning. Every excuse. Every moment I convinced myself things would improve if I just stayed quiet a little longer. When I opened my eyes again, Dominic was still waiting. Patient. Steady. Unmoved by silence. I do not want to talk about names, I whispered. He nodded immediately. Then do not. Relief washed through me so suddenly that I almost missed it. No pressure. No demands. No interrogation. Just acceptance. Dominic stood and walked toward the window. The city lights reflected across the glass behind him. You know something interesting, he said quietly. I shook my head. People think strength means enduring everything alone. He paused. The strongest people I have ever met were the ones who finally decided they deserved better. The words settled deep inside me. For several seconds, I could not speak. Then a knock sounded at the door. One of Dominic's associates entered briefly and handed him a small envelope. Dominic opened it, glanced inside, and became very still. Not angry. Not surprised. Focused. The man left immediately afterward. I noticed the change at once. Something important had happened. Dominic looked toward me and carefully placed the envelope on the table. Grace, he said quietly, I think I finally understand why you have been trying so hard to hide. And for the first time that evening, I realized someone had been looking into my story long before I was ready to tell it. The city started whispering before it started changing. I did not notice it at first. For several days after that conversation, life appeared normal on the surface. I returned to work. I served tables. I smiled at customers. Yet something had shifted beneath the routine. Dominic never called unexpectedly. He never demanded answers. He never pushed for conversations I was not ready to have. Instead, he simply appeared. Sometimes he sat in the VIP section for an hour and left without speaking to anyone. Sometimes he stopped by the restaurant for coffee and spent most of his visit reading reports. Somehow his quiet presence became a constant. Then the whispers began. Olivia mentioned that a local business owner had suddenly resigned from a community board. The manager commented that several long-forgotten complaints were being reviewed by city officials. Customers discussed legal investigations involving people who had spent years avoiding accountability. None of it seemed connected until I noticed a pattern. The same attorneys appeared repeatedly. The same advocacy groups. The same investigators. Different stories. Similar outcomes. One afternoon, I was leaving the literacy center where I volunteered when I noticed a black sedan parked across the street. Dominic stepped out before I reached the sidewalk. "You are becoming predictable," I said. To my surprise, he smiled. "You volunteer every Thursday. That sounds suspiciously like surveillance. That sounds suspiciously like concern." I shook my head, unable to hide a small laugh. For the first time in months, laughing felt natural. We walked together toward a nearby cafe. The spring air carried the scent of fresh rain and blooming flowers. Families filled the sidewalks. Children played in the park across the street. It was such a normal afternoon that it almost felt unreal. After we sat down, I noticed Dominic studying the crowd. Not searching. Observing. Protecting. It seemed instinctive to him. "Something is happening," I said. His attention returned to me. "Many things are happening. You know what I mean." For a moment, he considered his answer. Then he nodded. "Some people are finally being asked difficult questions." A chill moved through me. "Because of me?" Dominic's expression softened slightly. "Because truth matters." The simplicity of the answer left me speechless. He was not trying to punish anyone. He was making sure people could no longer ignore what they already knew. The distinction mattered. More than I expected. As the afternoon sunlight reflected across the cafe windows, I realized something else. The fear that had followed me for months was changing. It was still there, but it no longer controlled every decision, every thought, every step. Dominic noticed my silence. "What are you thinking?" he asked. I looked out toward the busy street before answering. "I think the city feels different." He followed my gaze. "Maybe it does." I smiled faintly. "Or maybe I do." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Dominic looked toward me with the same steady calm that had unsettled me the night we met. Except now it did not feel unsettling. It felt reassuring. "Grace," he said quietly, "sometimes justice begins long before anyone sees the result." And as people passed beneath the golden afternoon sunlight, I began to understand exactly what he meant. Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it arrives so quietly that people only notice it after everything has changed. 2 weeks after my conversation with Dominic at the cafe, the city seemed to be moving in a different direction. News stories appeared almost daily. Investigations that had been ignored for years were suddenly making progress. Organizations that once dismissed complaints were now responding publicly. Community leaders who had looked the other way were being asked difficult questions. Nobody mentioned Dominic's name. They did not need to. Everyone knew. One evening after work, I sat alone in the restaurant's break room scrolling through local headlines on my phone. Article after article described accountability, transparency, and reform. Words that had once felt distant now appeared everywhere. Olivia walked in carrying a cup of coffee and glanced at my screen. "The city is losing its mind lately." I smiled faintly. "Maybe it is finally finding it." She laughed and shook her head. "You have definitely been spending time with important people." After she left, I stared at the headlines a little longer. For the first time, I began connecting pieces that had never made sense before. Dominic had never talked about revenge. He had never spoken about punishment. He never even asked for names after that first conversation. Instead, he focused on systems, records, witnesses, lawyers, facts. The realization stayed with me all evening. 3 days later, I finally asked him about it. We were sitting on a quiet terrace overlooking the river. Sunset painted the water gold and orange. Boats moved slowly beneath the bridges while city lights flickered to life along the shoreline. "You could have handled everything differently," I said. Dominic looked up from the documents he had been reviewing. "Differently how?" "The way people expect someone like you to." A faint smile appeared. "And how is that?" I hesitated. "More dramatically." The smile widened slightly. Drama is inefficient. I laughed to spite myself. Then my expression softened. You never tried to destroy anyone. Dominic closed the folder and set it aside. No. Why? For a moment, he watched the river below. Because fear changes behavior temporarily. His voice remained calm. Accountability changes it permanently. The answer settled quietly inside me. It explained everything. The investigations. The legal reviews. The public scrutiny. Dominic was not trying to create fear. He was creating consequences. Real ones. Fair ones. The kind that could not be ignored once the truth became visible. Later that week, I attended a community event sponsored by one of the literacy programs I volunteered with. Families filled the park. Children ran between booths carrying books and balloons. Teachers spoke with parents. Volunteers distributed supplies. It was the kind of event I loved. Simple. Hopeful. Meaningful. As I moved through the crowd, I noticed something unexpected. People were talking openly about seeking help. About speaking up. About supporting one another. Conversations that once happened behind closed doors were happening in the sunlight. The change felt impossible. Yet there it was. Real and undeniable. When I saw Dominic standing near the edge of the park, watching quietly from a distance, I finally understood. Justice had never been about power. It had been about giving people the courage to stop hiding. And somehow, without realizing it, he had already started teaching me the same lesson. Some memories do not fade with time. They wait quietly until something reminds them to return. It happened on a rainy evening nearly a month after the community event. I was helping close the restaurant when Dominic appeared near the entrance. The dining room was almost empty. Chairs had been stacked. The last customers were leaving. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows, reminding me of the night everything began. You look tired, I said as he approached. A faint smile touched his face. That is because I spent most of the day in meetings. Important meetings? Usually. I laughed softly. For a moment, everything felt normal. Comfortable. Familiar. Then I noticed something unusual. Dominic was carrying a small leather folder. He rarely brought personal items anywhere. Curiosity immediately surfaced. He seemed to notice. There is something I want to show you. My pulse quickened. Not from fear. From anticipation. We moved to a quiet table near the windows. Rain blurred the city lights outside into ribbons of gold and silver. Dominic placed the folder on the table between us and opened it carefully. Inside were several photographs. Old photographs. The first showed a younger Dominic standing beside a woman with kind eyes and dark hair. The second showed the same woman sitting on a porch swing, smiling at someone beyond the camera. The third stopped me completely. The woman was wearing long sleeves despite the summer heat. Her smile looked genuine. Yet something about her eyes felt familiar. Sad. Tired. Careful. I looked up. Dominic was watching the photographs instead of me. My mother, he said quietly. The room seemed to grow still. She always smiled, he continued. Everyone thought she was happy. His voice remained calm, but I could hear something deeper beneath it. Not anger. Grief. Respect. Memory. I looked down at the photograph again. Suddenly I understood. Not every detail. Enough. You recognized something when you saw me. Dominic nodded once. Immediately. Rain continued falling beyond the glass. The city outside disappeared behind reflections and light. When I was a boy, he said softly, I watched people ignore things because acknowledging them would have been inconvenient. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph. I promised myself I would never do that. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The weight of his words settled between us. Everything finally made sense. The way he noticed details others missed. The patience. The refusal to look away. It had never been about curiosity. It had been about memory. About a promise made long ago. I carefully returned the photograph to the folder. I am sorry, I said quietly. Dominic shook his head. Do not be. His expression softened. She taught me something important. I waited. A faint smile appeared. People deserve to be seen before they ask for help. Emotion tightened my throat unexpectedly. Outside, the rain continued falling. Inside, the last missing piece of the story finally settled into place. And sitting across from Dominic in the quiet glow of the restaurant, I realized he had never saved me because he was powerful. He helped because years ago he learned what happens when good people pretend not to notice. The door opened again on a bright spring morning. Not a private dining room door. Not a locked office door. Just the front door of the restaurant where everything had begun. Sunlight poured through the windows, filling the dining room with warmth instead of shadows. For a moment, I stood outside and looked at my reflection in the glass. The difference was impossible to ignore. Months earlier, I had arrived every day hoping nobody would notice me. Now, for the first time in a very long time, I was not trying to hide anything. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The familiar sounds of the restaurant greeted me immediately. Coffee machines hummed. Plates clinked softly. Staff members prepared for lunch. Service. Everything looked the same. Yet somehow it felt completely different. Olivia noticed me first. Her eyes widened before a huge smile appeared. There she is. Several coworkers turned toward me. I expected questions. Curiosity. Awkwardness. Instead, I received something far simpler. Respect. Genuine respect. It turned out that when people finally stop carrying fear, others notice. The morning passed quickly. Customers arrived. Orders filled the kitchen. Laughter drifted through the dining room. Around noon, the front doors opened again. I did not need to look up immediately to know who had entered. Some presences are unmistakable. Dominic crossed the restaurant with his usual calm confidence. Yet something about him seemed lighter than before. Less burdened. As though a promise he had carried for years had finally been fulfilled. He stopped beside my station. "Good afternoon, Miss Miller." I smiled. "Good afternoon, Mr. Valenti." A faint smile appeared in return. "I was hoping to steal a few minutes of your time." Olivia nearly dropped a tray trying not to eavesdrop. I laughed softly and followed Dominic toward the entrance. When we stepped outside, the city stretched before us beneath a perfect blue sky. Cars moved through busy streets. People hurried along sidewalks. Life continued exactly as it should. Dominic glanced toward the restaurant door behind us. "Do you remember the night we first spoke?" I nodded. I remember every second. His gaze rested on the entrance for a moment. Then he looked back at me. For a long time, I worried that I made the wrong decision. The admission surprised me. "Why?" He smiled faintly. "Because I locked a door and frightened a woman who already had enough reasons to be afraid." Emotion tightened my chest. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I finally shook my head. "You did not frighten me because you locked the door." His expression softened. "No," I smiled. "You frightened me because you saw the truth." The city noise faded into the background. Dominic studied me for a moment before nodding. "That is fair." We both laughed quietly. Then his expression grew serious once more. "Grace, that night was never about keeping you inside." I knew what he was going to say before he said it. "I know." He glanced toward the restaurant entrance. "I locked that door because the world had already taken enough from you. For once, I wanted you to have a place where nothing else could reach you." Tears filled my eyes, but this time they came from gratitude rather than fear. Standing there beneath the spring sunlight, I finally understood everything. He had never locked me in. He had locked the fear out. And sometimes, the greatest act of protection is simply reminding someone that they deserve to feel safe again.